Coming up next, is it the most elaborate cover-up in rock history? Now, some would say yes. For today's episode, we got a good one. We're covering a band that was at the forefront of the Cultural Revolution. They go on to change music forever. However, there are many out there who believe that this band's entire history is a lie. They say that they have the evidence to prove it. This is a story filled with intrigue, deceit, car crashes, doppelgängers, plastic surgery, a strange mammal, and a band that allegedly hid clues in their art. We'll consider the evidence and follow the clues to see if we can get to the bottom of all of it. Is there any scrap of truth to any of this? There are incredible claims. Or are we just talking about a fun and entertaining urban legend? We're going to find out. We're going to solve it next on Professor of Rock. Hey, music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. You know, if you remember ever getting your hair cut with a Flowbee, you're going to dig this channel of deep musical nostalgia. Remember the commercial for that? Make sure to subscribe below right now, click the red button, and click the bell so you always know when our latest and greatest come out. We also have a Patreon. You can check out additional catalog of exclusive content there and become an honorary producer and check out our merch as well. Oh man, we got quite a show for you today. A lot of research, a lot of things that I known previously, but we're going to solve one of music's greatest mysteries. We're taking a deep dive into what I think is the most infamous and absolutely entertaining conspiracy theory of the rock era. One that's fascinated fans of the Fab Four in particular, even if it is way out there. As I mentioned the Beatles, I'm sure you already know what I'm talking about. I've got 3 words for you. Paul is dead. Today we solve the mystery. Was Paul McCartney killed in a car wreck and replaced with somebody else? Billy Shears? Let's get into it. So a little bit of history. The Paul is dead urban legend, that actually first started gaining momentum in the fall of 1969. Before then, there had been rumors that McCartney's health was declining since 1966, and whispers of his alleged death had been circulating since about 67. These purported that Paul had been killed in a traffic accident, and we'll get to that in a minute. But let's jump ahead to when the rumors started to snowball. The first known article about Paul's death was printed on September 17th, 1969, in the edition of the Drake University student paper. The Times Delphic is what it was called. The article was called, "Is Beatles Paul McCartney Dead?" It was written by Tim Harper, who referenced clues pointing to Paul's demise in the White Album, Sgt. Pepper, and the Magical Mystery Tour albums. Less than a month later, on October 12, 1969, the Detroit radio station WKNR-FM with DJ Russ Gibb behind the mic dug into the Paul is Dead story. The hunt for the secret truth began after a caller named Tom laid out evidence for McCartney's death on air. For instance, he told Gibb that by playing the Beatles' White Album track Revolution 9 backwards, you could hear the words, "Turn me on, dead man, turn me on, dead man."
Turn me on, dead man. Turn me on, dead man. Turn me on, dead man.
The track also held other clues like the sound of a car crash. That call led to an extended discussion about Paul McCartney's alleged death, with both the DJ Gibb and callers considering additional clues. And then just days later, the Michigan Daily newspaper published a joking review of the recently released Abbey Road. The author of this one was a university student from Michigan. His name was Fred Labor. He had actually heard Gibbs' show. His article was titled "McCartney Dead, New Evidence Brought to Light." Now, for his piece, Labor used clues from Gibbs' program along with others that he actually admitted that he just made up. Labor was surprised when the story was picked up by newspapers across the U.S. And then from there, the rumors burned like wildfire, and reporters started to contact the Beatles for official comments. A lot of people don't know that. Paul, who had traveled to his Scottish farm on October 22nd, was contacted by Peter Brown for a statement for the press. Now, in response, McCartney quoted Mark Twain saying, and I quote, "Rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated." Yet the statement did little to quell the gossip. Apple continued to be bombarded with queries from reporters. They finally stated, "We get letters from all sorts of nuts, but Paul is still very much with us." Now, on October 24th, Paul McCartney agreed to an interview with Life magazine at his High Park farm in Campbelltown, Scotland. In it, Paul suggested that the stories had started after he adopted a lower public profile. He He said that once he did an interview a week to stay in the headlines, but since starting a family, he preferred to live a more private life. Now, not surprisingly, Paul was adamant that he was very much alive, saying, and I quote, "If the conclusion you reach is that I'm dead, then you're wrong because I'm alive and I'm living in Scotland." Now, additionally, Paul told the Life reporter, and I quote, "I've done enough press for a lifetime and I don't have anything to say these days." That interview was released in November of 1969 in that edition of Life magazine. The cover story ran with the headline, "The Case of the Missing Beatle. Paul is Still With Us." And there, plain for all to see, was a photo of Paul, Linda, and their children at that Scottish farm. So with Paul confirming through interviews that he was in fact very much alive and posing for photographs to prove it, how could anybody believe this crazy rumor? Never underestimate a good conspiracy theory, right? Paul is Dead enthusiasts insisted that he just couldn't be the real Paul. Rather, the truth was that Paul McCartney had been in a fatal car accident clear back in 1966, and he was in fact replaced by an imposter. The story goes that on November 9th, 1966, Paul had an argument with his bandmates during a Sgt. Pepper recording session. He drove off really angry in his car, and he was distracted by a meter maid, and not seeing that the traffic light changed, he crashed and he was decapitated. And if you just followed the clues, you would indeed solve the mystery, is what people would say. And then they say a funeral service was held for Paul, with John officiating as priest, with eulogies given by Ringo and George, followed by a procession with John at the head. And then, to keep all this on the down low, a doppelganger was chosen from the winner of Paul McCartney Look-alike contest. Now, in order to further increase his resemblance to McCartney, the winner underwent plastic surgery and learned to play the bass guitar left-handed. In the end, a man named William Campbell, or Billy Shears, depending on who you talk to, he was a Scottish lad, and he was McCartney's replacement, and apparently to some, the new Beatle would secretly be called Fall. He was an even better musician than the original McCartney. But the legend goes that the Beatles, bothered by a guilty conscience, kept burying clues in their music and their albums, both orally and visually, that fans could study and try to solve the enduring mystery. And in the end, they might know the truth. But let's get one thing out of the way up front before we get into any of this. The alleged car crash, it couldn't have happened, because between November 6th and November 19th, 1966, Paul and his then girlfriend Jane Asher were on vacation traveling through France and Kenya. But I'm sure there's a theory to cover that as well. But you know what? Let's indulge the narrative for just a minute and explore the supporting clues, because it's really fun. Almost all of the evidence is contained in various Beatles albums, both in the songs and the album artwork. Unfortunately, because of time constraints, so we can only make an abbreviated examination, because there's a lot of clues out there. But we'll hit some of the main clues from the albums that would precede, and bear with us on each one: Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Magical Mystery Tour, The Beatles, The White Album, and Abbey Road. So starting with Sgt. Pepper, the band began recording the album just a month after Paul's alleged death. That started on December 6th, 1966, and it concluded on April 21st, 1967, and then it was released in May 26th of that year. As far as song clues, we find would-be revelations in A Day in the Life, Lovely Rita, and She's Leaving Home. Beginning with A Day in the Life, the Lennon Pen lyrics give us a couple of leads. Consider, for example, the lines, "He blew his mind out in a car, he didn't notice that the lights had changed." These, of course, references to the supposed accident. "He didn't notice that the lights had changed." Lovely Rita provides us with the next puzzle piece. The song itself is put forward to explain the reason for McCartney's death. The accident was caused because Paul was distracted by the meter maid's beauty. Then we get another detail of the events in the opening line of She's Leaving Home, which gives us the moment when the accident happened, which was Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock as the day begins. Of course. Couldn't be any other reason for that. 5 o'clock as the day begins. Beyond the songs themselves, though, the album cover provides a lot of clues, starting with the band, who appear to be standing next to a freshly dug grave. Paul's grave? Well, the yellow flowers on the grave are in the shape of a bass guitar, and Paul played bass. Some people even think the flowers spell out the name Paul. That's a stretch. Plus, the 3 sticks on the yellow flowers reportedly represent the 3 remaining Beatles. So diving deeper, below the T in the Beatles, there is a statue of the Hindu destroying god Shiva, and his hand is pointing straight up at McCartney. Also above Paul's head, you can see an open hand, which in some religions is a symbol of death. And finally, Paul is also the only Beatle holding a black instrument, the color most often associated with death, right? From there, the alleged clues, they go on, but I'll touch on a couple more for the album. If you check out the gatefold sleeve, you can see McCartney wearing a badge on his arm, which appears to read OPD. So what does that stand for? Well, people have said officially pronounced dead. Lastly, on the rear cover, Paul has his back turned to the camera, insinuating that he is hiding his true identity. But if you're not convinced, let's move on to the Magical Mystery Tour for a few clues there. The Magical Mystery Tour was recorded over 2 periods in 1967. There was April 25th and May 3rd, and then there was August 22nd and November 7th, 1967. It was released as an LP in the States on November 27th, 1967, and as a double EP in the UK on December 8th, 1967. Like Sgt. Pepper's, the Magical Mystery Tour album is said to contain a number of death clues, beginning with the title track, which closes with the lines, "The Magical Mystery Tour is dying to take you away. Dying to take you away, take you today." This, of course, suggests that the mystery is about death, Paul's death. One of the most debated clues comes from the coda for Strawberry Fields Forever, which is maybe the most iconic double A-side single ever. I think it is. The flip side, of course, featured Penny Lane.
Strawberry Fields Forever. Penny Lane, there is a barber showing photographs.
The two were released on February 13th, 1967, far ahead of Magical Mystery Tour. But at the close of Strawberry Fields, John Lennon famously mutters the words, "cranberry sauce." Or does he? Some have said that he's actually saying, "I bury Paul." Again, that's a stretch. What do you hear? Man, my dad showed me this one when I was growing up. Notably, the original Magical Mystery Tour album also contained a 24-page booklet which featured cartoons, song lyrics, and still photos from the actual movie. And within those pages, many more potential clues, depending on who you ask. For example, a photo from the Your Mother Should Know sequence shows all 4 Beatles dancing in white suits. 3 of them are wearing red carnations on their lapels, George, Ringo, and John. And of course, Paul's not. Paul is wearing a black carnation, which once again is a death symbol. In another photo, McCartney sits behind a desk in front of a sign with words, "I was." Other photos in the booklet show Paul without shoes, which also, of course, signifies death, since many people are buried without shoes. And then there is the cover of Magical Mystery Tour, and this is where we get really creative. When you hold up a mirror to the word Beatles, the letters reveal a sequence of numbers, a phone number, 231-7438. Paul is Dead believers have alleged that this number belonged to a London mortuary. Was this where Paul was interned? Finally, we have to talk about a very strange mammal in Beatles lore, the walrus in the room, right? The Magical Mystery Tour album cover shows a photo of the Beatles dressed in various animal costumes. There in the middle is the black walrus. In case you didn't know, that's a harbinger of death in certain parts of Scandinavia. You have to reach for this one. So do you still think that Lennon is really the walrus? Well, all this leads us to the White Album, which was released on November 22nd, 1968. On the White Album's Glass Onion, Lennon famously remarks that, "Now here's another clue for you all. The walrus was Paul." That's irrefutable evidence, right? Paul was the black walrus, so Paul is dead. Actually, responding to questioning about the meaning of the lines, John Lennon explained that the entire lyric was a joke and there was no real meaning behind it. He also claimed that Glass Onion was a throwaway track and that he only wrote the line "The Walrus was Paul" to confuse and mess with Beatles fans. Well, it definitely seemed to work. Now, for obvious reasons, there isn't an abundance of clues about Paul's death on the cover of the White Album, because there's nothing on the cover, but there are other sonic clues to consider here. We already mentioned, Revolution 9, and what he says there, "Turn me on, dead man." But there's a couple of other ones. At the end of "I'm So Tired," Lennon mutters, "Monsieur, monsieur, monsieur." How about another one? When played backwards, some have heard the phrase, "Paul is dead, man, miss him, miss him." And Ringo's "Don't Pass Me By" has lyrics that read, "I'm sorry that I doubted you. I was so unfair. You were in a car crash and you lost your hair." Of course, this has been interpreted as further confirmation of McCartney's fatal car accident.
You were in a car crash and you lost your hair.
All right, so let's wrap up this morbid scavenger hunt with the final, Abbey Road. This was released on September 22nd, 1969. Arguably, this is the ultimate source of proof for conspiracy theorists. Proponents of the Paul is dead theory see the Beatles crossing as a funeral procession. John dressed in white is the priest. Ringo dressed in formal attire is the funeral director or the undertaker. Paul comes next. He's both barefoot and out of step with the others, and he's the corpse. Finally, George, who is wearing denim working clothes, he's the ditch digger, the grave digger. Paul's barefoot status once again points to his burial and his closed eyes signifying that he's dead. Additionally, he's holding a cigarette in his right hand, even though he's left-handed. Just another clue that something isn't right here. In the distance, the license plate of the Volkswagen Beetle reads LMW 281F. Clue sleuths read into that as well. They think the LMW stands for Linda McCartney Window or Linda McCartney Weeps. The second half of the plate 281F is interpreted as Paul would have been 28 years old if he had not died. This requires reading the 1 as the letter I, though. At the time of the release of Abbey Road, Paul was 27, so it kind of worked. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we just don't have enough time to cover all the alleged clues pointing to Paul's death. We could do a part 2 if you're interested. Let me know in the comments. But if you're interested in jumping down the rabbit hole yourself, plenty more from where this came from. Let's talk about the aftermath, though. Clearly, none of the Beatles bought into this hoax. Paul's always taken it in stride. He's never given any credence to the rumors. John, for his part, referred to the myth in his 1971 anti-Paul song, "How Do You Sleep?" Singing the lines, "Those freaks was right when they said you was dead. The one mistake you made was in your head." But he was obviously not serious. When asked by Rolling Stone about the Paul is dead story, John said, and I quote, "I don't know where that started. That was barmy. I don't know. You know as much about it as me. The whole thing was made up. We never went for anything like that." Despite all common sense and evidence pointing to the contrary, though, the Paul is dead urban legend has continued to live on thanks to the conspiring faithful. So, of course, pop culture has picked up on this. You can find references to Paul is dead in The Simpsons, in Alan Goldshire's 2010 mashup novel, Paul is Undead, the British zombie invasion, and more recently in the graphic novel Paul is Dead that came out in 2020. Paul himself has repeatedly addressed the urban legends throughout the years. Very funny. For example, in the episode of Carpool Karaoke, he said, "At that time, everyone was stimulated with way too many stimulants, so it was a pretty crazy time. We just kind of let them go. There wasn't really any way you could stop it." And famously on a 1993 episode of Saturday Night Live, Chris Farley, in all his comedic glory, interviewed McCartney about his career. And among the questions he asked, "You remember when you were with the Beatles and you were supposed to be dead? That was a hoax, right?" Paul's deadpan response was brilliant, of course. "Yeah, I wasn't really dead."
Yeah, I wasn't really dead.
Paul also parodied the long-running conspiracy with his third solo live album titled Paul is Live. Recorded in '93 during his New World Tour, the cover paid homage to the Beatles' Abbey Road, but instead of the 28 if number plate, the car shows 51 is instead. But if you're not willing to take Paul McCartney at his word, Consider his extensive solo career catalog as evidence. McCartney's discography consists of 26 studio albums, 4 compilations, 9 live albums, 37 video albums, 2 EPs, 111 singles, and 79 music videos. Additionally, he's churned out 40 top 40 hits on the Billboard Hot 100, 23 of those making the top 10, 9 going to number 1, the most successful songwriter in history. If this isn't the real Paul McCartney, this guy's one hell of an imposter. But from the other side of the equation, this imposter is, as Sgt. Pepper says, the one and only Billy Shears. But seriously, the fact that this new Paul McCartney went on to duplicate the original Paul's voice and his songwriting genius completely, it's ridiculous. It's a crazy theory. It's obviously complete nonsense. But you know what? It's so much fun to go down the Paul is dead rabbit hole. You know, when I was growing up, my dad told me all these stories, even pulled out all of his Beatles records, showed me the clues that he and his friends had passed back and forth when he was in high school before the internet. And then, of course, me and my friends, we passed along the clues and talked about it as well. It's just an urban legend that has stood the test of time. But the real mystery I'd like to solve is if the Beatles ever put any of these clues into their albums or songs, or if it was just a huge coincidence. They've never really said for sure. It's become a huge part of rock and roll lore, really started rock and roll lore. But what do you think? Is there any possible way that Paul could have died in 66? Is there any shred of truth to this urban legend? What other conspiracy theories should we cover on here in rock and roll? Is Jim Morrison still alive? What about Elvis? Was Kurt Cobain murdered? Tell us in the comments section. Leave us a comment about Paul McCartney and this wild urban legend. What are some clues I missed? What are some clues you'd like to see? Would you just like to see a part 2? It's a lot of fun to talk about, and McCartney has such a great sense of humor about this. If you like our content, we invite you to subscribe below. We'd love to have you as part of our community. Till next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.